It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and James Palmer, an FBI agent, had finally gotten the chance to take a well-deserved vacation with his two daughters, Lily and Maya. They had been planning this trip for months, and James was thrilled to spend quality time with them at the luxurious Blue Ridge Resort in Virginia. Lily, his 16-year-old daughter, had always loved swimming, and Maya, just 11, was just as excited to splash around in the pool. James, a tall, strong black man in his early 40s, was dressed casually in his swimming trunks, ready to relax by the poolside while watching his daughters enjoy the water. They had arrived at the resort earlier that morning, checking in with big smiles and excitement, and now, they were finally here. The Blue Ridge Resort was famous for its lush scenery and luxurious amenities. Its sprawling pool, complete with comfortable lounge chairs, seemed like the perfect spot to unwind. As they walked through the lobby towards the pool area, James couldn't help but smile at how rare it was for him to take time off like this. Being an FBI agent had its demands, but this weekend, everything was about family. As they passed the other guests, a few people glanced their way. James didn't think much of it at first. People often looked at him and his daughters, especially since Lily, who had a fair complexion, looked much more like her mother, whose white background was clearly visible in her skin tone and features. Maya, on the other hand, looked more like James. Her brown skin and curly hair were unmistakable signs of her mixed heritage, which had often caused them to stand out in public. But James had long stopped caring about such glances. When they reached the pool, Lily and Maya jumped in joyfully, splashing water and laughing. James sat back in a lounge chair, soaking in the warmth of the sun and the joy of being with his daughters. Everything seemed perfect. The sun was shining brightly, the water was sparkling, and his girls were having the time of their lives. James leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to feel at peace for the first time in a long while. But the moment was shattered when two men approached. James opened his eyes and saw two white police officers, their uniforms crisp and clean. They stood taller than most, their faces grim, and their eyes locked onto James with suspicion. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers said, his voice laced with an uncomfortable tone. "We need to speak with you." James, trying to keep his composure, looked up from his lounge chair. "Yes, can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "We got a complaint," Officer Bradley said, his expression unreadable. "It seems like you're in the company of a minor who doesn't seem to be related to you." He gestured towards Lily, who was swimming with Maya. James frowned, his mind racing. "That's my daughter," he said firmly. Officer Grant raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing as they shifted to Lily. "Your daughter?" he scoffed. "A white girl?" James felt his stomach churn at the insinuation, but he remained composed, trying to push down the anger that started to bubble up inside. He had dealt with situations like this before. As an FBI agent, he knew how to keep his cool, even in tense moments. But something about the tone in the officers' voices made his skin crawl. It wasn't just suspicion, it was the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong. "I told you, she's my daughter," James repeated, standing up slowly, his tall frame now almost level with the officers. "I'm here on vacation with my daughters. I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Bradley stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to need to come with us," he said, his hand resting on the handle of his handcuffs. "We need to verify this claim." "What claim?" James asked, his voice now rising. His frustration was beginning to show, but he tried to hold back. "You're under arrest," Officer Bradley said, his hand reaching for the cuffs. James felt his heart race as his voice rose in protest. "For what?" he demanded. "This is ridiculous. She's my daughter." Officer Grant sneered. "Tell that to the judge." Before James could respond, both officers grabbed him by the arms, their grip tight and forceful, dragging him towards the exit. A crowd began to form, murmuring as they watched the scene unfold. James' mind raced. How had things escalated so quickly? And what about his daughters? He couldn't let this go on. He had to protect them. Lily, noticing the commotion, hurried out of the pool. Her wet hair clung to her face as she rushed toward her father. "Dad, what's going on?" she cried, her voice shaky with fear. James turned to face her, trying to remain calm. "These officers think you're not my daughter," he said. "Tell them who you are, Lily." But before Lily could speak, Officer Bradley cut her off. "We don't need to hear from you, little girl," he said dismissively. "We've got everything under control." Lily's eyes filled with fear as she looked at her father being dragged away. "Please stop. He's telling the truth. He's my dad." But the officers ignored her, their grip tightening on James as they pushed him toward the police car parked nearby. James felt like he was in a nightmare. How was this happening? He had spent his entire career serving his country, protecting others. And now, here he was, being treated like a criminal in front of his daughter Saul because of the color of his skin. Inside the police car, James sat uncomfortably in the back seat, the cold cuffs biting into his wrists. He couldn't see his daughters anymore, but he could only imagine the fear and confusion on their faces. He needed to stay calm. There had to be a way to resolve this. But first, these officers needed to realize the mistake they were making. The officers walked around to the front seats, still smug in their demeanor as they prepared to drive away. James could feel their racism like a weight pressing down on him. They weren't interested in the truth, they only saw him as someone who didn't belong. Suddenly, Lily's voice rang out louder, breaking through the tension. "Stop, you can't just take him." James' heart skipped a beat as he heard his daughter running toward the car. Her voice was trembling, but filled with determination. Her feet slapped against the pavement as she closed the distance. Officer Bradley rolled his eyes and stepped out of the car. "Little girl, you need to back away. This man is under arrest." "But he didn't do anything," Lily shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. "He's my dad. Why won't you listen?" Bradley snorted in disbelief. "Yeah, right. Your dad? What kind of a fool do you take us for?" he mocked. Officer Grant chuckled from the driver's seat. "Nice try, kid, but we've seen it all before." James' heart sank as he watched the officers dismiss his daughters' words. They weren't just refusing to listen, they had already made up their minds about him the moment they saw a black man with a white girl. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about power, control, and prejudice. But then Maya stepped forward. Despite her small frame, her voice was filled with determination. "He's our dad," she said firmly, her eyes brimming with tears. "You can't just take him." James' heart ached for Maya. She was so young, but here she was, standing up for him, refusing to let this injustice stand. He couldn't let this spiral any further. He needed to act quickly. These officers weren't going to listen to his daughters, and they were definitely not going to listen to him unless he did something drastic. "Listen to me," James said, leaning forward as much as he could from the back seat, his voice steady but firm. "Before you take this any further, you should check my ID. I have proof that these are my daughters." Officer Bradley looked at him with a sneer. "You think we're stupid?" he said. "We know what's going on here." James took a deep breath, keeping his emotions in check. "I'm not asking for much. Just look at my ID. You'll see that I'm telling the truth." Officer Grant rolled his eyes from the driver's seat. "Nice try. We'll deal with you back at the station." Just then, a hotel staff member, Mrs. Jenkins, approached. She had been working at Blue Ridge Resort for over a decade, and she had seen more than her fair share of incidents, but this was something she couldn't ignore. She had been watching from the lobby, and she was not about to let this injustice happen. "Excuse me, Mrs. Jenkins said sharply, stepping in front of the police car. "What's going on here?" Officer Bradley looked at her, clearly annoyed. "Mum, this doesn't concern you." "Oh, it concerns me plenty, Mrs. Jenkins replied, her voice stern. "I've been watching from the lobby, and I know who this man is. He's staying at our hotel with his daughters, and I can vouch for them." Bradley hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely, Mrs. Jenkins said, folding her arms across her chest. "And if you arrest him without reason, you're going to have a big problem on your hands." Grant muttered something under his breath, but it was clear that the officers were starting to doubt themselves. James could feel the tide turning. Mrs. Jenkins had given him the break he needed. "Before you do anything further," James said, his voice calm but filled with authority, "check my ID. You still have time to fix this." Bradley, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced at his partner. After a tense pause, he opened the car door and motioned for James to hand over his wallet. James complied, his movements deliberate and slow. Bradley flipped open the wallet, and his eyes froze as he stared at James's FBI badge. "What?" Bradley stammered, his face turning pale. "What is this?" James had remained calm, his voice steady as ever. "That's my FBI badge. You've been harassing my daughters. Whoa. By the way, are my daughters and you've made an awful mistake." Bradley's hands shook as he fumbled through the ID cards, finding James's credentials as an FBI agent along with his family information. Officer Grant leaned over to take a look. The smug expression he had worn so proudly evaporated, replaced by a mix of disbelief and shame. You're FBI?" Officer Grant asked, his voice now lacking the authority it once held. "That's right," James said, locking eyes with the officers. "And those girls you've been harassing? They're my daughters Lily and Maya Palmer. If you just listened to them from the start, none of this would have happened." Bradley's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he fumbled to remove the cuffs from James's wrists. His hands shook, and the once confident officers now seemed utterly flustered. I didn't know," Bradley stammered, his face pale. "You didn't care to know," James interrupted, his voice now firm but calm. "You made assumptions based on nothing but the color of my skin." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mrs. Jenkins stood, watching with a stern face, her arms crossed, as Lily and Maya rushed to James's side, relieved but still shaken. The officers stood frozen in shock, the power dynamics having shifted entirely. They were no longer in control. Now, they were facing an FBI agent whose authority dwarfed theirs. "I'm going to file a complaint," James said, his voice steady. "Not because I want revenge, but because you need to be held accountable for your actions. Maybe next time you'll think twice before treating someone like a criminal without any evidence." Bradley, now clearly flustered, looked up. "Sir, we didn't mean for it to go this far." Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her tone disapproving. "You two have a lot to answer for," she said. "I've worked here for years. I've never seen anything like this." James motioned to his daughters, who stood by his side, and he looked down at them, making sure they were all right. They had seen the worst of humanity today, but they had also seen the best of it. "You girls okay?" he asked softly. Lily nodded, tears still in her eyes, but a hint of relief on her face. "Yeah, Dad," she whispered. "I just didn't understand why they didn't believe us." James sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Some people judge others based on how they look. But that doesn't make it right. What matters is that you told the truth." Maya squeezed his hand, her small frame still trembling. "But it's not fair," she said. "They shouldn't have treated you like that." "I know, baby," James replied gently. "But we can't control what others think. We can only control how we react. And we always stand up for ourselves and tell the truth." Lily squeezed her father's hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You didn't get angry even when they were wrong." James smiled down at her, feeling a sense of pride. "I'm proud of both of you. You stayed strong, even when things were tough." As they walked away from the scene, James couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. The truth had come out. The officers would face the consequences of their actions. His daughters had learned an important lesson today. Always stand up for what's right, no matter how difficult the situation seemed. They had seen firsthand what real strength looked like. Mrs. Jenkins, still standing nearby, approached James and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said sincerely. "People like those officers give this place a bad name." James smiled weakly. "Thank you for stepping in. It really meant a lot." Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "I'll make sure the hotel compensates you for this. It's the least we can do after what you've been through." As James and his daughters turned to leave the pool area, Maya looked up at him. "Dad," she asked quietly, "why did those men think you weren't our dad?" James paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "Sometimes, Maya," he began slowly, "people judge others by how they look. They don't always take the time to understand who someone really is. But that doesn't make it right." Maya frowned, her face filled with confusion. "It's not fair," she said softly. "I know, sweetie, it's not fair, but we can't control how others think. What we can control is how we react. And we always tell the truth." Lily squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad." James smiled down at his daughters, feeling both pride and relief. The day had been tough, but in the end, justice had prevailed. And for the officers, the real consequences were just beginning.